welcome everyone to the inaugural event of the Delphi Talks. So, over the coming weeks and months, we will be hosting a series of discussions around the theme of storytelling. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to run through a few brief housekeeping points, particularly for anyone who's a first-time visitor to the platform. There is a button at the top of your screen called Seating. If you click that, it will give you some options to join us specifically here in the theatre, where you will be able to sit down. If you look to the bottom left, you will see there is a chat window with a number of channels, including one called Delphi, and you can ask for help there if you get stuck. And as and when you have any questions that you would like to ask our guest, please do note them in there, and one of our community managers here today will collate it all, and at the Q&A we can either hand the mic to you or read the question out for you. If you are here in the theatre, sitting in the theatre area, you will also see there's some buttons called screen and room and speaker and montage, and those are camera buttons. If you want to click those during the show, it just gives you a sort of moving montage of images. If you want to get out of that view, you'll see there's a look away button at the bottom of the screen. There's also a stand up button at the bottom of the screen if you want to leave seat. So the last button to draw your attention to is a clap button, which is also in the top menu bar, and we're not quite sure what kind of terrible cacophony we're going to get from that in a moment when I unleash us all to press it in welcoming our first guest, who is the co-founder of the smash hit West End production Showstopper, the Improvised Musical. So please, everyone, spam the clap button for Mr. Dylan Emery. Fantastic. That wasn't actually anything like as horrendously unpleasant on the ear as I was expecting it to be. I'm trying to find the button now to switch it off. But Dylan, welcome to the Delphi Talks.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a very beautiful arena you have here.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here. So, as befits a conversation with a master of improvisation, I have meticulously prepared and rehearsed my questions, which I will now proceed to read at you in a pedestrian manner. Number one,
Yes.
Before we talk about the art and the technique of improvisation, perhaps you could just tell us a bit about your current show, Showstopper.
Okay, so Showstopper, the Improvised Musical, as it currently stands, what the show is now. So it's a West End show. We tour around the world. This is the basic idea. It's a fully improvised musical. It's a West End style musical, fully choreographed with a full storyline, with songs, with characters that you care about, with a full arc. It's a full evening of entertainment that looks more or less like a West End musical would look, with a band, with a cast of 6-7 people, except that it happens to be made up on the spot. So the setup basically is the audience, the stage opens up. There is a writer of musicals, and he's on the phone to his producer, and the producer is demanding, his latest hit show. And the writer turns to the audience and says, "Look, I've got no ideas left. You need to help me," and asks the audience for help. And so then asks the audience for, where should we set a musical, and what will the title be, and what musical styles might be in there. And the audience decides, or sometimes they vote by shouting, and they give their suggestions as to what it's going to be. And then the band starts playing, and the cast come on and start singing and dancing, and then the entire musical is made up from scratch. And that's the entire show.
Fantastic. So we are going to play the trailer in a second, but I want to emphasize the point that this really is, you really are going directly at the heart of the West End big show marketplace here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did a West End run at the end of last year. I mean, our aim is always, it's a theatre show which will run. People will come. We did, we've done runs elsewhere as well, like in Toronto recently, and again in big theatres. So Our show is designed to be for the theatre audience and people who like comedy theatre. Instead of going to see Book of Mormon, they might come and see us. Instead of also going to see Les Mis, they might go and see us, because it's not only is it a funny show, but it is also a genuine celebration of everything that's musical theatre. And the quality of the music and the storyline and so on is absolutely, our aim is to make it absolutely up there, except with this extraordinary difference, which is that the audience gets to decide what it's about every night. And so it's different every single time.
Yes, and what's really extraordinary, I suppose, about that is that some of the other well-known improvisational shows that that we might be familiar with, and I hate to go there, but let's get it out of the way quickly, just to make a comparison with Whose Line Is It Anyway? And I said that as fast as I could possibly say it. That is a show, a wonderful show, where the improvisation was fundamentally the end goal. Whereas, is it fair to say that improvisation is means to an end?
Yeah, so there's two elements to improv. I mean, in Whose Line Is It Anyway? Which I say was fantastic, and I must say I had no problem with it at all, because it was the very first time that improv was made so publicly popular. And also, of course, I'm friends with lots of the people who were in that original show, and now there's a live version of it as well. The point of that wasn't that it was seeing the improv was part of it, but also it was parlor games. Like it's basically people being witty on the spur of the moment, and coming up with being ridiculous and playing big characters, but it's incredibly transient and brief. It's all about, if you give someone a challenge, it's like you might play this game at, you could play those games at Christmas with your family, and they might not be as high a level, but it's that style of game. So the difference with what we have done, the very different challenge, is using some of the same skills, but it is to try to create a story which will make the audience cry as much as laugh. Then we know we've actually, done something good that night.
Fantastic. Okay, so look, let's move to the clip. Digvijay, our AV manager, will play it. I should just give everyone a heads up before we play it. I think the audio might be a little bit louder than our voice over IP, so you guys might be, I want to be ready to just slightly dial down. We haven't added volume controls to the video yet, so it might be just a little bit louder, but if you click the screen button at the top of your window, you'll be able to look straight at it. And Digvijay, if you want to play it, then we can get just a sense of how the show goes.
You need a new musical. I need your help.
Monday morning and it's 9 a.m. and the oil is pumping from the sea again. Monday morning we're here and we're just
absolutely gobsmacked. I mean, it's breathtaking.
all so clear.
Right in the middle of the big Atlantic, look up at that blue sky. And as the pit goes down and into the floor, and we're all hoping for some oil.
It was absolutely amazing.
Yes, it all explodes in the end. Won't you see the bad?
Very talented performers that are talented and create songs that are as good as anything you would see written.
You will be blown away by the talent of this company.
Where you least expect, you can
It makes you just go, wow, it's incredible. I'm a huge musical fan, and this was one of my #1 musicals in London right now, and it'll never be seen again. This is a one-off night.
Great, thank you, Diggy. I think some people may have had a few issues with hearing that, but hopefully most people were able to hear that clearly and can now hear us again as we continue our conversation. So that, I mean, that shows clearly everything you're talking about in terms of it being, something that stands up against any other West End musical in terms of the sense of occasion and the energy and the scale, and also, exactly as you say, the professionals, the highs and lows that the audience experiences. But at the same time, it's still the case that your audience is coming because they're excited about the improvisational aspect of what you're doing. So it's not just a musical.
No, it's not.
What
Absolutely.
What is it about the improvisational aspect that captures the audience's attention as well as those show tune aspects?
Okay, so I'd say probably the way to put it is this: if you describe what we do, like if we just said to someone, I've got an idea for a show, it's going to be an improvised musical. It sounds like a terribly bad idea. Fundamentally, it sounds like a dreadful idea, because musicals are almost the epitome of the most disciplined art form that you can get in the theatre. You've got choreography, you have to be in exactly the same spot, amazing vocal harmonies, your voice, you've got very little time for dialogue because of the compressed time that you're in. You've got to hit all the highs and lows, and there's often massive sets going around the place. So it just seems like a terrible idea. So a lot of people therefore will come to see the show when they haven't seen it before for the sport of it. So they're seeing not the theatrical, not the storytelling. They come because they expect to see a challenge met or fail to be met. So they come for that. And that is absolutely, I think, a part of the thrill of improvisation. And a lot of shows rely very heavily on that thrill, on just seeing people do something that they shouldn't be able to do, and maybe failing occasionally, and as well as sometimes succeeding. And that is, I say, much more like watching sport than it is watching art. But what we try to do is to add the artistic element of it, the storytelling element, so people are surprised by how much they actually suddenly find themselves caring and how emotionally engaged they are by the end of the show.
Well, it's interesting because what you're talking about there is that they're coming to see you take a risk, and in a way coming to see yourselves almost putting yourselves under a sort of a contrived pressure, as it were. But that begs the question: why don't you perform? Have you thought of performing drunk or drunken in a blindfold? And I think the answer to, well, I resisted the temptation of asking if you've ever considered performing sober. But the point I'm making is that it's not just a risk of failure. You're also taking a risk when you improvise, in that you are exposing something about yourself, or you're risking exposing something about yourself. You're risking blurting something out that you and I wouldn't normally do, and the audience wouldn't normally do in the normal course of our day-to-day events. So there's a risk of honesty, a surprising honesty, which is also part of the thrill, I think. Is that fair to say?
Yes, in fact, what we find is one of the interesting elements of it, because obviously you can do improvisation at a very low level, like people do it all the time. Kids constantly improvise, and actually they have no problem with it. They invent characters, and they're making stuff up all the time, and they can create storylines and so on. What then happens is adults fail to do it. They forget, or they are encouraged to think it's impossible, or it's not something that any decent person would do. So there is part of it is just that you see people doing something which you think is sort of brave, basically. So you're watching people do things that you think you wouldn't be kind of confident enough to do. But I think after a bit, you are what makes it, I think, compelling to watch is when you lose that sporting element and you find yourself an integral part of the story. So you're actually you are contributing to the story in some fundamental way, and I think that's why you feel completely engaged. So the people who come back to see our show many, many times, they absolutely feel like the story was only created and could only be created because they were there, because they're literally shouting stuff out, and because of their energy that night, and because of the fact that it's such an ephemeral thing that it doesn't actually, it will never be seen again. I think that's kind of an extraordinary part of it.
So if a performance like this, if improvising, I mean, this goes to a point which Keith Johnson, who is one of the very sort of the godfathers of improvisation, wrote an amazing book which I know you've read and I've also read, called Improv, in which he talks about wrong-footing the internal censor inside you. He also talks about how other art forms do it. Maybe poetry does it, where you focus on rhyme rhyme and meter, and that kind of, suckers you into saying things that you wouldn't otherwise have said. And obviously the time pressure and the real time presence of improvisation does the same thing. If that's essentially sort of almost like an antidote to the the over prepared spokesman in us all, the politician who never says anything that isn't approved by a committee for public release, I have to ask, with your sort of eye for improvisational techniques and your ability to see those techniques in people, is Donald Trump improvising in a way that you understand it?
Yeah. Okay. So you can see. So one of the things I do. Okay, you're talking about truth in comedy. Sorry, that was actually the point you made before, which I sort of strayed away from. There's actually a book by Del Close, who's the other big guru of improvisation, and it is called Truth in Comedy. And something that improvising does is absolutely open you up to just saying what you think. And one of the things we have to do in the first few years of being an improviser, and in fact we constantly have to monitor it, is to try to disable the censor at the back of your head, which stops you from saying the first thing. Because we learn that censor. So talking about Donald Trump, clearly he's not on a script, but what he has got is he's doing what we might call script prov. There are elements which are pre-learned sound bites, which obviously he said many, many times, and that's why he repeats himself a lot. There are, especially in his case, he doesn't learn long bits of patter, because some salespeople, they have a very fixed, they'll have like a 1-minute description of their company or why their product is amazing, and they kind of know it's really good, it's well honed, they always trot it out because it's a very good way of expressing it. Well, he doesn't seem to have that, but what he has is short clips of 3, 4, 5 words, which he constantly puts together. And then what he does is he repeats them. So it's a semi-improvised lesson in rhetoric, and he's actually pretty effective. I mean, he very much speaks like a motivational speaker might speak. And motivational speakers, at least the ones I've heard, a lot of them, it's more of a hypnosis than an actual intelligible message. You can do this, you are empowered. And they'll repeat but the core messages again and again. And they are directly emotional messages. But actually, if you strung them together, they would have no intelligible structure to them. And in fact, at the end, you're going, actually, there is nothing in that really, other than I get the impression you like or you don't like immigrants, for example. So I'd say that's a sort of semi-improvised technique. Now, the advantage he's got, what he's been very effective with, is because it's not scripted, because it's not slick, because he is actually speaking off the bat, but in this sort of semi with these little phrases that he likes to use, he looks like he means it. And I believe in the moment he probably does. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's very appealing. And one of the advantages of improvisation as opposed to learning script.
Oh, I wonder have we just lost Dylan? Can anybody else?
Hello, I'm here.
Oh, yeah, no, we lost you for a moment there. Just for a second.
Okay.
So,
yeah, no, I'm back. So yes,
okay,
I don't know where you lost me there, but yeah.
No, just as you were talking about how he is. I think we caught almost all of it. But I think that I think the conclusion I draw from what you're saying is that although he's extemporizing with a sort of stream of consciousness and all of those individual sort of sound bites, what he's not doing, which really qualifies as proper improvisation as an art form, is he's not actually taking any risks. He's not actually at risk of blurting out something that isn't from that sort of approved box of confetti of statements that he's already got. And I wonder whether that's, given for you and your cast and your crew, do you find yourselves sort of falling into do you have to sort of guard against doing the same thing yourself, guard against falling onto a sort of ever larger box of sort of prefab components that you can draw on? Do you have to sort of get past that as a professional who does this all the time?
Now, what I would say is, I would compare it to being a musician. So if you're a musician, so I'm a guitarist, and I'm thinking about being talking about being a guitarist. If someone else plays the rhythm and you're playing lead, then you'll often find yourself noodling around using the same stock phrases but in slightly different combinations. And I think, therefore, in music, you're absolutely in danger of repeating yourself. in an improvisation, you can be in danger of repeating yourself, but only if you had such fixed roles, like I'm lead in your rhythm and you're playing the sax and you're playing the drums. But actually, in the way that most people do improvisation, anyone can be called upon to do anything. So if someone speaks to me and says, doctor, I'm ill, there isn't a thing that I can rely on. There isn't a phrase that I could use that is self-sufficient in the way that a guitar might be able to play a solo by themselves, because dialogue isn't comprised of a series of monologues, generally speaking. So because of the constant contact with the other person, you're forced to be somewhere else. And if you do have little runs that you find yourself repeating, what it does is it immediately takes you out of the moment. It means you're no longer actually there, but you're just in your own head. A very good example of that actually is a guy who was in fact in Whose Line Is It Anyway at the start, and a brilliant improviser, John Sessions, who we've done some work with, and he is actually an amazing guy. But his real speciality is monologues in the style of a particular author. And actually, if you interrupt him and try to get in there, he finds that kind of impossible. Like, that just disturbs his flow. That's not what it's all about. So if you can become an expert at the monologizing, then actually you lose the ability to be in a scene with someone else. So in storytelling, which is about scene work, I think that's kind of not possible. It works against your effectiveness.
That's really interesting. Funnily enough, John Sessions is amazing, extraordinary talent. He's actually in the film that we are covering on Tuesday. We have the producer of Loving Vincent coming in, oil-painted theatrical release film, and he plays, I think, the art supplier to Van Gogh, and it's a very beautiful performance there. But so you touch upon essentially another difference between the extemporizing politician and the kind of improvisation that you're involved in, which is that, Trump or any other politician is standing alone effectively on the stump, whereas it is all about that for you. It is all about that again, what Keith Johnson, I think, describes as kind of the space between the performers, which sounds a bit zen, but it's actually a very profound observation, isn't it?
It is, but also I think there's another fundamental difference between his intent and our intent. His intent is to deliver a message, but our intent is to discover something. He's not trying to discover anything. So that's fundamentally what changes absolutely everything else.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about that sort of space between different performers, because I remember it's the idea that it's almost like the idea those what are they sort of optical illusions of is it two faces looking at each other, or is it a vase? And it took me a while to really register the point that he was making, that Johnson was making. But I suppose you have one person on stage and they're just standing around, and they might be in a particular, you might be learning something about their character when they're standing on stage. But when another person then joins them on stage, or indeed in the real world at the bus stop or in the dentist's waiting room or wherever it is, you no longer have two individuals standing in their own space. You inevitably have two individuals who are essentially locked together in some kind of physical encounter. I mean wrestling with each other, but the space between them, they're not independent agents, and that's sort of part of the craft that you learn, I think, as an improviser, isn't it?
Yes, in fact, actually, I would say that space between them, that's a very good phrase, because as well as it obviously being true, it's about the relationship between the two of them. The thing that will get in the way of you telling a story, whether it's actually directing a scripted play or whether it's improvising a play, is not allowing space and filling it full of stuff. Because you can think, oh, I'm not interesting enough. I'm going to speak a bit more. I'm going to move around. I'm going to do my moving of my body thing because I think that's more interesting. And what that does is actually, it actually disrupts the actual communication that's happening between those two people, most of which is nonverbal, of course, this physical stuff, which is much more fascinating. Films can have really long chunks where you're just watching the face very slightly change. And that's absolutely fascinating, because we will do the rest of the work. And it's not just the relationship between the people, it's also the relationship between the person and the space. Someone walks into a space, and in the improv terms, you don't know where they are yet, but they're feeling it and they're working out where they are. If they're walking on, and as far as the improviser is concerned, they're walking into a church and it's silent and it's dawn, that will create and they're looking around in that way, and their body's reacting in that way. the audience will be absolutely fascinated by what this person is going through, even before they say anything or anyone else comes on stage. So actually giving that space for that to happen is absolutely vital. We are so good at reading signals as human beings that actually the vast majority of the stuff that improvisers try to do is a distraction from what the scene is really about, rather than being what the scene is really about.
And in that context, the other sort of hugely fundamental sort of thought process that I think must, from my understanding of your work, must dominate your thinking all the time when you're sure if thinking is quite the right word, but you're performing craft all the time, is the concept of status transactions. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit.
Yes, so status is something that actually, okay, there are various schools of improvisation. Two of the big schools was Keith Johnstone, who you mentioned, who was a Brit, worked at the Royal Court as a play reader, and then developed lots of our ideas about how you improvise interesting theatre, and then eventually moved to Calgary in Canada, and that's where he still is in his school out there, Loose Moose, and does lots of amazing work. Another guy, mostly the most important one, is Del Close. He came out of Chicago, and they had a very different way. There was much more about social realism. They would take news stories, and they would also develop what's called the game of the scene. So the idea is you're trying to find what's funny in this scene. There's two kind of quite different ways of approaching it. Now, how in the Del Closian way of doing it, they never even thought about status transactions. They just try to find out what's going on in the scene. Oh, well, one person's coming in and they're cold when it should be hot. Well, let's just explore what that would be like if everyone was too cold when it should be hot. And now let's do when it's hot. You know, what would be if you felt too hot when it was too cold, and what happens if you felt too tall when you were actually really short. And you just explore and find the games. What Keith Johnstone did was he approached it differently. He asked the question, what is it that makes the relationships between human beings fascinating? And he developed this notion of status. Now, status in Keith Johnstone's way of talking about it doesn't mean social status. It means the dance of dominance and submission, which we are constantly in whenever we're interacting with someone. So, for example, at the moment, you have granted me higher status by asking me to speak. And in your tone of voice, you'll be implying things. In the way I'm speaking, I'm implying things back. We have a status relationship with all the people listening. Generally, they're being nice because they're raising our status. If we could see them, some of them will be lowering our status because they'd be raising eyebrows or shutting uncomfortably or not paying attention. And other people will be giving us much. Other people will be giving us much more status by being fascinated by what we were seeing. So we're constantly in a dance. We're also in a status relationship with the world around us. I did a very interesting gig at the House of Lords, and it was for the Turkish Bar Association. Totally weird gig. I don't know why I don't know how they found out my name. Wow. But anyway, so they came along, and there was a bunch of barristers, and they're all Turkish barristers working in London. And the head of the Turkish Bar Association is this formidable lady. And I did this thing about status, and I said, it's really interesting because I do lots of corporate stuff on status because it's all about how can you, understanding your real interactions with other people, and most of them are non-verbal. In fact, I'll just talk about the basic difference, I guess, just before I talk about the Turkish Bar Association. So if you like, a high status thing is just taking control of a situation, and low status is allowing someone else to have control. One way it's described is, imagine as a prehistoric man, you've got two fundamental ways of approaching a situation. The bear comes up to you. You can either stand up big and shout, and the bear might think, yeah, it looks a bit too much trouble. Okay, I'll leave him alone. Might hurt me a little bit at least before I kill him, but still I don't want to take that risk. Or you lie on the ground and you curl up, and the bear goes, oh, well, he's not a threat. It's fine. So actually, they're both ways to try to live, and both of them can be effective. Obviously, sometimes they will, sometimes they won't, but they're much more effective than not doing either of those things. So the idea is then that status, 150,000 years later, is basically kind of the same kind of thing. And you'll see it in people's physicality. When the shoulders go back, the head comes up, your voice slows down. You don't allow interruption in your voice, your vowels lengthen. These are all signals of status. Whereas low status people, when they're being low status, they're granting status elsewhere. Their hands might clasp, they might cross their legs a bit more. It can show respect, and it can show you're listening to someone. It can also show you're uncomfortable, but not necessarily. So high and low status are it's not about confidence and not confidence. Giving someone higher status can be an incredibly powerful thing to do. And in fact, the most successful corporate people that I know, the corporate managers, are masters of status. Same with politicians.
That's very interesting, because I always think of, I mean, the sort of the absolute status archetypes of high and low status that I always go to in my mind, just as the defaults are sort of Clint Eastwood as the high status, incredibly still, head always still, and then sort of the Woody Allen constantly fidgeting, nervous hands glancing around, head moving as the low status character. But actually, those are the naive versions, and as you say, there is low status character that is. That can be extremely manipulative or controlling at the same time.
Absolutely.
And so, tell us how. Yes, please do come on to the Turkish anecdote, and also very keen to hear how that manifests itself on stage as well.
Okay, so the Turkish anecdote, yes, so it was very interesting. So the person who was the head of the Turkish Bar Association at the time, so we did the whole thing, and I talked about the fact also you can be high status beneficent, or you can be high status aggressive. And actually, generally, if you're high status aggressive, that will tend to make you then you're sort of high status veneer, but a low status person. So a great example of that would be, almost any baddie that Alan Rickman has played, where they're actually sort of super high status, but they're always just going, why is it not going the way I want? So it's like a super high status veneer, and inside they're just going, oh, the world hates me. Or you could have someone who's super low status, but actually is utterly serene. And actually that then raises their status. So there's lots of mixes of interesting things. People can drive, like you can have a low status president, you can have a high status servant. Jeeves and Wooster, fantastic example of a super high status servant, but absolutely does everything his master says. He is there totally in service of his master, and yet he's the one absolutely, of course, absolutely high status. So there's lots of different mixes. So in the Turkish Bar Association, we went through a bunch of examples, but also we got them to play scenes. And I said, look, be aware of your status relationship with your colleagues, but also with the jury. Understand what effect it's going to have. If you are high status and aggressive with them, they're just going to not like you. That doesn't help. High status beneficent might work, but it could be patronizing. Low status, in order to engage with them, followed by high status to show that you're certain, might be the most effective way to communicate. Did all that. It's really interesting. Anyway, then the head of the bar association afterwards came to me and she said, "Well, really interesting, but I've got a question. I've got a nanny who's just joined. My old nanny was fine, but my new nanny, I'm treating her exactly the same way, but she's constantly upset and she's crying all the time. And apparently it's something I'm doing, but I don't know what." I knew exactly why. I had a very good guess. This person was so high status. She was trained high status. She was actually perfectly nice. She found it impossible to grant anyone any status at all. So if someone said something of any knowledge, they knew something, she would have to say, "Yes, I know." It would be impossible for her not to, and try to add to it, which of course is it's a low status, it's a status lowering move. Oh yeah, I know that, which is implying you didn't need to tell me that. You're a waste of space. I know more. So even though she thinks she's being generous, she's absolutely not. And so when you play a status game with someone which lowers their status, but it's not a game they've agreed to play, it stresses and upsets human beings. And that's almost certainly what was happening to her nanny. So there you go. That was the story.
Interesting. And it's also, it's very interesting that to consider that she probably was able to modify her behavior as a result of your the perspective that you had given her on her own sort of her own innate character traits. So the other big aspect of improvisation that is critical for the kind of performance that you do is the audience's participation. Now, that's particularly pertinent with Showstopper. Do you want to talk a little bit about why that's important in the medium as well?
Yes, so there are two ways really of approaching improvisation, and one way, which is the more typical, especially, well, actually, there's a particular form of improvisation which is very, very common called the Herald. Okay, and basically it came out of Del Close, it came out of the Chicago School. Basically, you get a word from the audience. And in the typical form of it, you then just do a bunch of scenes. Typically, you'll do like scenes with different characters. You'll have little gamey bits in the middle with groups, everyone playing, and then scenes again with characters. By the end of it, it takes 45 minutes. And essentially, the audience has had no participation other than to laugh or not laugh. Now, that still is important, but they haven't directly intervened. So that's one way of doing it. Essentially, audience shout something out just to kind of prove that it's improvised, and then after that, they have to sit down, shut up, and watch the brilliance, or not unfold. And actually, it can be very good. There's actually a fantastic duo called TJ and Dave doing an amazing two-person improv in the States. And actually, they had a show which was called Trust Us, This is Completely Improvised. And they literally took nothing from the audience because they didn't feel they needed to. It was a bit of a you're just doing it just to prove a point, but they didn't feel they needed to. And their show is no worse for it. So there's that way of approaching it. Then there's the other way. Now, I came out of the school I've done that training and I love doing those sorts of things and they're fine. But I was trained by Ken Campbell. And Ken has a very, very different attitude to what is interesting. And he doesn't think it's interesting to watch actors be brilliant on stage. What he thinks is actors on the edge of their abilities being forced to be extraordinary. And one way of doing that is you keep the audience absolutely there at all times. So it's not the audience watching you, but it's the audience is the show. That's why we approached it from such a different angle. And we started with Ken. The show that we very first did with Ken Campbell was we were asked to by Mark Rylance, who was the artistic director of the Globe Theatre at the time in 2005. He asked Ken to do a celebration of Shakespeare for the whatever it was. It must have been April the 23rd for whatever birthday and death day it was of Shakespeare. So Ken then gathered a group of actors around him, and he knew a bit about improvisation. He knew about Keith Johnston, and he thought, well, why don't we do Shakespearean improv games of the sort that Keith Johnston does? So the entire show that was done, and they discovered this fantastic guy called Max Webster, who's now a very successful director. He came and he'd learned in Cambridge. He'd learned the technique of being able to improvise in iambic pentameter. He just worked out how to do it, and in Elizabethan mode as well. So he was really good at it. So he came along, and Ken just saw him and went, "Oh, well, if you can do that, then we've got a show." So he did a whole show with the audience shouting stuff out. What should they do next? Suggestions as to what should happen. And he had games like, who could play the best wounded messenger, or who could be the most boring lord, and the audience would shout out suggestions. So you had this astonishingly vibrant show where the audience is creating the show by shouting stuff out, and the actors respond. And it comes out of this thing that theatre used to be, until essentially the invention of electric lights, really, and all really good gas lights, is that the audience was clearly there. Up until 300 years ago, whenever you had a play, the audience just was there. In Roman comedies, they would often start, like a servant would leave a house, one of the two houses involved, and he'd see the audience and say, "Hey, you never guess what's happened? Caecilius has just been shagging Melia." They couldn't avoid the fact that the audience was there, and that made it absolutely engaging. But with the invention of really good lights, and lights where only the stage had to be lit, and of course it was very expensive to light the audience, so therefore owners of theatres wouldn't bother doing it. At that point, the fourth wall comes slamming down, and actors become very unhappy with the notion that the audience can actually see them. It becomes something they're not used to or not trained to do. So what Ken was trying to do with all his stuff is you break through that by constantly keeping the audience, involved in the creation of what's going on. So that's what we do in Showstopper. In Showstopper, I will stop the show. I usually play the writer. I'll stand up, the show freezes, and everyone freezes on stage. Music freezes, lights go to a different state, and I'll talk to the audience and say, what should happen next? Will he kiss him or kill him? And the audience will shout out what they want. I'll sit down, and immediately you see it happen. So yeah, it's part of the joy of it, and part of the sort of amphitheatrical, sporting joy of it is the immediacy of that audience response.
Well, I am also going to turn to the audience in a minute. I think I'm just going to give you one last sort of summing up question, because it brings us back to that aspect of storytelling. It seems to me that what you've been talking about there suggests that part of the unique experience of watching improvisation is that as an audience member, your relationship is almost more with the performer than it is with the character. So rather than a movie where you sort of vicariously live through the protagonist of the narrative, in improvisation it's almost as though you are vicariously living the life of a storyteller, experiencing their successes and failures as they try to tell a story in real time in front of other people, which effectively is what we're all doing all of the time, which is why it fascinates us to vicariously do it through an improviser. Is that fair?
So I think there's a couple of things. First of all, yes, exactly that there is. It's just a joy in seeing someone under pressure. Like watching, a brilliant mind in panic is a wonderful thing. We did a Radio 4 version of our show, and I think it was rather good. I really enjoyed it. But the people there watching the recording of the radio show were having a much better time because they could see the actors in those moments of crisis and pressure. Watching the moment of creation is kind of fascinating. There's another really interesting thing as well about how you create stories. So my wife's a screenwriter, so she's writing stories the regular way. Okay, she writes feature films. So she is writing, and she'll generally work out the plot, and then she'll work forwards to, where does it get to, and she'll try to hoop in all the things along the way, so that by the end, everything neatly comes together, and all the themes are kind of explored, and it ends, relatively neatly at the end. So her job is that. It's like a weaver. Now, with an improviser, you can't do that because you don't know what the end is. So, and if you try doing that, then you end up with a absolute horror show, which, a lot of improvisers go through. I've been through many times, where you're each person is individually trying to aim at the end of the story. But of course, you're not listening to anyone else. There are no character interactions. It's a total mess. It's like the worst written story ever. And there are a lot of shows where people end up doing that. It's just not good. What you need to do instead is you need to turn around, look back at what has happened already, and go, well, these elements are in here. These character situations are happening. You look at everything that's there, and then you step backwards into the future. Yeah? So you're looking backwards at what's already happened. You face your back to what's going to happen next, and you don't worry about what it's going to be. You just make sure that everything that's in there is still in there, so you're in that world. So, and then you suddenly find yourself and you've moved the scene on and you made some amazing move and you didn't realize you were ever going to do that. But it works because it included all those things. And I think so that backwards way of storytelling makes it, I think, fascinating. It's also, I think, a lesson to the world about how to live your life. This is what I would say anyway. It's a bit more philosophical. I saw a fantastic play about Quentin Crisp. Betty Bourne did this amazing one, a play about him. And there's this bit where he says, I really feel sorry, this is Quentin Crisp's words, for the youth nowadays, because back in the day when you were a carpenter, then you'd grow up and you become a carpenter, or maybe you become a blacksmith. If you're a lawyer, you become a lawyer, or at a push, you become an accountant. But now, the youth ends their training, looks out on this landscape of a million possibilities, and is allowed to choose any of them. And every single one will cut out 99% of all the others, and they have no idea what's going to make them happy. And it's incredibly stressful and very, very difficult for them. And I think we could learn something using the improvisational kind of technique. So you basically look at your life and you go, well, what do I like? What makes me happy in my life? What are the satisfying things? You look backwards at everything you've got and you just make sure that they're still in your eye line. And then you just step with your back to the future and you just step into it. And whatever decision you make will be one of the right ones. So there you go.
Fantastic. Don't try that, obviously, on the side of a motorway, but anywhere else, it's probably a safe bet. Fantastic. Well, look, okay. I thank you very much. I'm going to I'm just going to organise our questions from the audience. While I'm doing that, just if you could just give us a little bit of detail of some of the other shows that you guys are involved with. I think it would be really interesting to hear. I think there's a children's version of Showstoppers, and I think you mentioned briefly the Shakespearean thing. I'm not sure if that's live and running at the moment as well, but if you can just give us some sense of the other shows that you're involved in that people might be able to look up and investigate, and just give me a second to organize these questions, and then we'll open up to the floor.
Okay, yes, so there's a bunch of different things I've done in my life. So yes, the School of Night is the improvised Shakespeare thing, the School of Night. You can actually go to theschoolofnight.com. It's a website, and it has got information about what we do. There's a sub-show of that, a show that came out of that called Rhapsodes, which is amazing. If you ever get a chance to see it, again, just go to the School of Night. We usually advertise it there. It's two-man improvised Shakespeare with two amazing performers, Anna Megiddo and Sean McCann, who are astonishing masters of extemporization in iambic pentameter. They are beautiful poets and prose and free verse improvisers. It's incredible, and they play all the different characters. But also, they'll then do things in the style of Mamet or Pinter or Beckett or whatever the audience throws at them. So it's a proper tour de force of literary improvisation. So that's the schoolofnight.com. There's another one called grandtheftimpro.com, and that is much more straightforward sketch comedy, but all improvised. And we do like shows every month in London where we have guests that come along. So grandtheftimpro.com. There's a thriving scene of improvised comedy and improvised theatre in the UK. It has come out of a very low level 10 years ago, and now it's absolutely peaked. There's a website, if people are interested, which is called thecrunchyfrogcollective.com, which I run. It's a free website for all the improv groups. So it's thecrunchyfrogcollective.com, and that's got a list of like all the groups that I know about in the UK, and it's got news and calendar events and everything that's happening. When I started that website about 15 years ago, there were about 10 groups in the country regularly doing improvisation shows and classes. There's now about 150. It's absolutely exploded.
That is extraordinary.
So yeah, so it's a brilliant time to learn to do improvisation, and it's happening everywhere. Corporate improvisation is on the up. Actors are starting to do improvisation now in drama schools properly, so they're actually learning to do it in order to create scenes in front of audiences that are paying, rather than simply using it as a sort of technique to free themselves up. And we're starting to teach now at a lot of the main acting schools and showing people how it can be done at this high level. And so it's a very exciting time for.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much. I am now going to open up to the audience with some questions. I've got a list here. I'm going to read a couple out, and we will also hand the mic out. I think I can go to Julie, who I believe has a question. Julie, I'm just going to enable your mic, and then if you can, which I've done now, and then if you can toggle the VoIP button to switch it on. Hello, Julie. Hi, welcome. The floor is yours.
I actually had two questions. I was really interested in whether or not you found yourself falling in love with sets of characters that you feel you'd probably want to write a non-improvisational screenplay or play about. I mean, is the audience coming up with something amazing every other day that you're just thrown by?
You know, especially with Showstopper, because it's such a finished-looking product. Often we get that question where people go, and also some of the songs are actually genuinely really good now because we've done so many shows and we're good at it now. So actually, you do get some properly beautiful songs where I'm sitting at the chair watching, I'm just going, that's just. So there are definitely times where there are moments in the show where you go, that song is wonderful, that moment is great, that bit of dialogue they improvise actually is just sweet. But you've got a choice. You could write all that down, and then, obviously there are always bits in improvisation of hesitation and things which you would rewrite. You could write all that down and rewrite it, and then create a new show. Or you could just make up another one, and it's just more fun to make up another one. So that's why we put all our efforts there. So we do come up with interesting things, but the effort required to polish it, in that time, we could just work on being able to create them more. So we end up not really doing it. Having said that, quite a few of our members, we're very good at writing musicals now because we're very, very fast at it. So our musical director, he literally can write a musical in like a week because he could do pretty high level writing just simply on the fly. And so it's not that hard for him. So it's really useful skill for any creatives because for that very reason.
Can I pop another one in, Rowan? Is that
go
all
on,
right?
yes. Yeah, go ahead.
So the other thing I was wondering is if you keep the same performers, or does new blood help with storytelling, with new types of storytellings, or is it the same cast for a long time?
Right, so there's two elements here. The same cast for a long time has massive advantages. One of them is they get better at it as long as they've got a decent director and they're actually rehearsing properly. Actually, a lot of people don't get better at it, but assuming you've got a really good attitude to practice and rehearse. So that's a really amazing advantage. And also, your group mind is so fluent that in our core cast for Showstopper, I know what someone's about to do, 5 seconds before anything has happened, because you just know what their patterns are. They know how they find the emotional beats in the scene. So there's an amazing, and because of that, you can see the entire cast start to move into position because they know that person's just about to start singing, and so they get themselves into their choreographic positions that look cool, and suddenly they're all singing together at the same time. This happens a lot, and of course the audience just goes, "That's impossible." And it's not impossible. It just takes 850 shows and 10 years of rehearsal. So there's a massive advantage to it. However, there's also big disadvantages to it, and why Fresh Blood is a brilliant thing. The disadvantages are that you get similar. People's own personality almost inevitably is going to be expressed through their improvisation, because they're not performers, they are writers, directors, choreographers, they're blocking themselves, they're doing all these stories, they're their own dramaturgs, So as a result, there are certain preferences they have about the kind of relationships they have. So one of the lessons, one of the rehearsal notes I have to constantly give and we work on is for people who are quite moral of our cast, don't like playing bad characters. They don't mind playing grotesquely bad characters, but actually subtle, interesting, selfish, nasty little weasels they find very, very hard to play because they don't like themselves. But they have to be able to play them to have the full range of possible stories. So that's the disadvantage, is that people will tend to have patterns, and it's very hard to break those patterns. But having fresh people coming in, they'll totally surprise you. And in fact, something we do every year in London, it's an amazing thing. It's called the London 50-Hour Improvathon. We've been doing it now for 8 years, 7 years, something, I don't even know how many years, many years. It's a 50-hour non-stop improvised show in London. It's the longest show in Europe, and it is just a series of 2-hour episodes without sleep. And the core cast don't get sleep, and we have improvisers from all over the world coming. It is a boiling pot of fresh ideas and unexpected turns and twists. So if you're interested in watching what happens when you absolutely throw people into the mix and see how they respond, I highly recommend coming along and watching a few episodes, 50-hour Improvathon.
Thank you, and thank you for your questions, Julie. I'm just going to jump to a couple of other people, and then we are a bit pushed for time, so I will wrap up by just getting us to spam the clap button again in a second. Hold on, I'm going to switch Julie's voice off, and I'm going to jump to where is he? Scrolling. Jackie 4, a voice I think you will actually know. Ask a question. Jackie 4, you are live. You need to toggle your button to switch the voice on. I almost heard something there. Sean, are you there? Oh, really, really tinny. Actually, I might have to jump to someone else. I'm not sure what's going on with your mic there, Sean. I'm going to jump to somebody else. Diggy, I'm just going to jump over to you. Where are you? I have everyone's in-world name is different to their out-world name. Here we are. Their shadows. Okay, I'm handing over to you, Digvijay. You need to switch on your voice now, and we'll see if we can come back to Sean.
Hi there.
Hey.
Hello.
Hi. Thanks for joining us today. I just had a quick question. What are the uses of improv in a corporate environment?
So it's really interesting. I've discovered, because I've also got a corporate world life. So I've kind of married the two together quite a bit. So there's one really obvious answer to that, which is in presentation skills. So if you're having to present in front of other people, one of the single biggest things in presentation that gets in the way. Okay, well, there's a slight rant about this. The way a lot of presentation skills is taught can be a whole bunch of things that you shouldn't be doing. Don't fiddle with your hands. Put your hands in your pockets if you have to. Stand up straight. Speak in this particular way. Do this, do that. So it's a whole bunch of instructions as to how to breathe and hold yourself and move. And all it does is paralyze the person. And you can see them when they've had that training. They come on stiffly like a robot onto stage and they try to express their message. I've never, ever seen it being helpful. I mean, I take that back. It can be helpful in one particular circumstance. You can take someone's physicality, diaphragm, voice, all of that, and you can totally reprogram it so it does become their natural way of speaking, and then they will be able to use those skills naturally. It's called a drama degree. You could do it in 3 years. Go ahead if you've got the time. The vast majority of corporate speakers are not going to be doing that. So instead, they get given this, 2 hours where they get told what not to do, and then they get even more paranoid and sort of scared about what they're supposed to be doing. It is not a good way of doing it. Far better. There are two single things which make a speaker good, and I've shared several hundred conferences, so I've seen this so many times from these people. One of them is that they must be relaxed, and the second is they must be passionate. Those two things are everything. Once you've got those two things, everything else will come through. Assuming you've got a half-decent sound engineer who can make the voice come up, you've got decent lighting set up so you can see their face. If you've got cameras, the cameras are there. Everyone else's job is to extract that and make it appear to everyone else. That person's job is simply to express it. It's a bit like being a film actor rather than a theatre actor. So the first thing you do is the use of improv, to answer your question, is you just get them to improvise in front of groups of strangers until they're no longer fearful. And also, you get them to learn their genuine passion, because then they need to tap into that when they're speaking. If they're not passionate about their topic, well, that's a shame. Ideally, get a different job where you are passionate about your topic, but the very least you could do is learn to be actually totally fearless in front of an audience. So that's really obvious. Second thing is the status stuff that Rowan mentioned before. Status is amazing. I did some work with a bunch of senior people at BP a while back, and that was really interesting. These senior executives who were, mostly unaware of how they were affecting other people around them. And also, I've done lots of work with like creative groups and like advertising agencies and marketing people, and you see them constantly fight each other for who's got the idea, who's got control of the idea. And it's a deeply inefficient way of creating. So I've also gone and worked with some of those groups, and you just literally get them to play games where they are rewarded for saying yes to each other rather than rewarded for maintaining control and saying no. And the productivity in terms of quantities of ideas and material to work with, triples in the space of usually an hour of one of these sort of workshops. And then, of course, the idea is they have to maintain that back in their own work environment, and that requires, constantly working with the team. Yeah, so those are the sort of three areas.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Diggy. So I'm just going to jump to one very last quick question from Mary, and then we'll just wrap up on the hour just about. We're just hitting past now. Mary, you should be able to enable your mic.
Hi there. Thank you for joining us. Question I had was, did you have any plans to bring the show to the US?
We would love to take it to the US. So we've been talking since we did our West End run and we won awards and so on. We have been talking to various US producers about doing something there. And we actually did go there. We were invited, and we were one of the producers very kindly invited us over, paid for us to all go over, and we spent 3 days doing shows in New York in a fantastic place. It's a synagogue that's called the Actors Temple, and it's kind of specializes in some Jewish actors, but it also is a theater. It's like 100-seat, well, it's actually about 200-seat theater, and they just use it for a theater. So we were there for 3 days and did it for industry. So we weren't doing it for the public, but hundreds of people came and filled the place basically, and there were all the people from the local kind of people, producers and actors and so on, all the invited people, and we did shows at like 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. because it was during people's work time. It was fabulous because the great thing about musicals is it's an American art form. No one else. The Americans invented it. Like, there are lots of art forms that different people invented. The Americans invented the musical. It is theirs. They love it, and New York absolutely, and Sondheim. So what was wonderful about it was the passion of the audiences to see something great rather than trying to get you into trouble was an absolute joy to see. Also, the fact that our show does not mock musicals. Our show, it's a comedy show, but only because we are trying so hard to make a great musical. And so that was really appreciated. So yeah, I mean, we're always in talks with US producers. If you know any, please ask them to get in contact with us, because I think it will go down a hit, and we certainly love performing there.
Fantastic. Okay, well, hopefully we will hear that is happening very soon. So look, thank you very much. I'm going to just thank you, Mary. I'm just going to give a quick note on housekeeping again, which is just to highlight that our next event is with Hugh Welshman, the producer of Loving Vincent, which is on Thursday at 10:30 p.m. UK. Sorry, on Tuesday the 12th at 10:30 p.m. UK time. That is 5:30 Eastern Standard. We will be back live then. I'm just going to enable the clap button again now, and perhaps we can all just spam that to say thank you to Dylan for his time today, and we look forward to hopefully welcoming you again soon. Thank you very much, Dylan.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
Continue that pause, isn't it? I need to get some better applause going. Okay, fantastic. Thanks, everybody. That is a wrap. I really appreciate everybody turning up, and particularly Dylan, thank you again. And I will be mooching around in world. Everyone's welcome to explore. Maybe someone will fire up some music and do some dancing. Dylan, thank you for your time, and we will see this on YouTube when we upload it, probably during the day tomorrow. Thanks, guys.